deal just to find out there were 3 parts to the program. So can I take the steps where I am today? Maybe when considering the circle and the triangle and looking at the title page with what you know up to this point, maybe the consideration is, maybe now after all these years, this is a good time to decide my place in AA. Here's an interesting story. A friend of mine calls me 9 years sober. He says, today's my 9th birthday, and I had no one in Alcoholics Anonymous to call in Denver. We got sober together. And he said to me, through a series of decisions that I've made, asleep to that I was making them, I found myself outside of AA, and I have no one to call on my 9th birthday. So wouldn't it be better to make a series of decisions awake with another person or persons that you trust as you're going through this process, so you're not making them alone in your sleep? And you find yourself one day way out here and you don't know how you've gotten way out here, and you're not really involved in AA anymore? It's happened to a lot of people, and I was greatly aware of that around these last couple years, because every convention I've ever been to, I don't know if any of you have ever noticed this, when they do a sobriety countdown, why is there always a big gap between 6 and 10? You ever notice that? I've noticed that. A lot of people around that time who haven't gotten what they've wanted, but have managed to stay sober, and a lot of people that have gotten what they've wanted, but aren't getting it anymore in AA, decide out of the program. Now, they don't all drink. Maybe this is a good time for me to decide, this is where I want to do it, and this is what I want to do. Maybe this process isn't what I want to do now after 10 years. Maybe this year I want to try something different. But wouldn't I like to at least have the grace and dignity to me being the one deciding? Do I believe this is a textbook? This book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholics, men and women, to recovery that there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describes the AA recovery program. I was told the most important word on that page is the word text. What does that mean to me? At that time, it meant a book that's meant to be done in order. A good math book would lay out addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions. And sometimes those of us who have been around for a while tell someone to go home and read how it works, and we wonder why they're confused. It would be like me not knowing anything at all about math and you sending me home to read about fractions. But where am I with this today? Am I willing to submit myself to this process today? Right now, where I am? And do I believe it's contained, and am I willing to do what's in here rather than on terms of my own? Maybe now this year I want to write inventory the way I want to write inventory. Maybe I want to come up with my own way of making amends. Maybe I want to come up with my own third step. Maybe that's what I want to do now. That's how a lot of it's gotten watered down. That's why there's so many ways to write inventory nowadays. People have done that. People have decided that. Is that what I want to decide? Or am I willing to submit myself to this process? I believe it all begins with, am I willing to do this on terms other than my own? And I believe the process of submission begins right here. I submitted myself to a group, their conscience. I sat there when I wanted to blurt things out, and I kept quiet. I shared when they asked me to share. I submitted myself to a group. So here's a question. If you can't submit yourself to a conscience of a group, can you submit yourself to God? Then I submitted myself to a man to do it his way, on terms other than my own. If you can't submit to yourself to someone else's way, can you submit to God? Then, thank God, that man had me submit myself to a process on terms other than my own. And that process took me to a God of my understanding. I believe submission, surrender, whatever you want to call it, is a process. I'd like to say, like some people believe, that I can bring about my own surrender, but there's only two things that have ever brought about my surrenders: booze and God. If I could surrender myself, I wouldn't be doing this work on a regular basis. I think there's a question at the end of the preface that needs to be answered before you take the third step. Now, I certainly wouldn't ask anyone to answer this question brand new. Just open this book. At the bottom of that paragraph, they ask you to maybe pause and reading one of these stories and say to yourself, that's happened to me, or more important, I have felt like that, or most important, yes, I believe this program can work for me too. I believe that's a question that needs to be answered before you take the third step. Do I believe this program can work for me? Now, I don't think I got a chance to talk much about a way of looking at this book rather than answers. Probably one of the most important things I found out about this book, once I saw that my ego is by nature a thief and it wants to take the answers from out here and put them in here, my sponsor said to me, we're going to look at this book as a set of questions and directions on how to have a spiritual experience. So when I read the book and they make a statement, I turn it into a question. I think one of the most other things that is really important about this book is when they say we, us, them, or they, you put I, me, mine. Make it in the singular and turn every statement you possibly can into a question. We'll see that especially more as we get into step one. I didn't know that the main purpose of this book is to show other alcoholics precisely how to recover, until I read the foreword to the first edition. And all of a sudden I see the main purpose of this book: to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. For them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experience will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person, and besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. Do I still believe that today? I consider those questions. I think not to spend too much time on the foreword to the second and third edition that gives an outline of our history from the first printing in 1939 to the next printing in 1955. Is some nifty information about our program. For lack of a better way, what I like to do with people, once we get to the doctor's opinion, what I like to do with people is look at the first step in 3 parts, because it's a 3-part disease, and we've talked about that on the title page. And I have this idea, it's not a reality, it's only an idea, that alcoholism might be a disease of the body, the mind, and the spirit. The first time I looked at the first step, now please don't give me any credit for being healthy or well-adjusted at the time or today. My saying to you that I do this work every year is not a great testament to my health and well-being in Alcoholics Anonymous. My testament to doing this work on a regular basis is because I am an alcoholic that needs the whole program. But my first time reading the first step, here's the way I saw it. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. I had this strange idea that the dash meant fill in the blank. And the way I wanted to fill in the blank was, I admit that I'm powerless over alcohol, and that's why my life has become unmanageable. because I thought the reason my life was unmanageable was because I was powerless over alcohol. And I thought the first half of the first step had something to do with the second half. And I thought the second half of the first step, this unmanageability, was because of the first half. Until you have some time around AA, not drinking, trying to manage your life on your own power. And what I started to find out was the first half of the first step has nothing to do with the second half of the first step unless you're still drinking. And that sober, my life had become unmanageable. And my life was unmanageable before I ever took a drink. When I see the definitions of unmanageability in our book: restless, irritable, discontented, full of fear, can't make a living, feeling useless. Everything on page 52. That fits me before I ever took a drink. That fits me when alcohol was not working. And that fits me 5.5 months away from my last drink, dying of untreated alcoholism in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was experiencing the unmanageability, which is the spiritual malady. Then, as I started to look at the first half of step one, and my sponsor said we were going to take one part at a time, I started to see, with the way this book is laid out, there's two parts to powerlessness: body and mind. So all of a sudden, rather than a two-part first step, I started to take people through the work looking at three parts: physical powerlessness, mental powerlessness, and a spiritual malady. The second half of step one. Now, for lack of a better way, and I wish that they had done it in a little more orderly fashion, with ending with a chapter, but they didn't, I would like to look at a section of the first step at a time. And the first section was step one. From my experience, we're going to look at from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23. And there is a solution. That's where a major turning point takes place. That's when they shift from looking at the physical craving to the mental obsession. You will find no more about the physical craving once I take a drink past page 23. So rather than lay the first step on some new guy, or rather than today, with all that I think I know, looking at the first step as a whole, I like to consider the symptoms of alcoholism first: body and mind. And I like to use from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23 to make those considerations. Now, I'll explain to you how I use each part of that book. Just from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23. I use it in 4 parts. How do I use the doctor's opinion? Well, when I read the doctor's opinion, having been a therapist, having all this knowledge about alcoholism, I read the doctor's opinion and I said, who the hell is this guy anyway? I mean, we're talking 1935 or 34. What are we talking about here? I mean, so much more has been revealed. Who knows Dr. Silkworth anyway? I saw nothing in the doctor's opinion but a doctor's opinion. But when an old guy said to me, why don't you look at the doctor's opinion as a set of questions to find out about yourself, and every time he makes a statement, you turn it into a question, all of a sudden the doctor's opinion came alive. Because I wasn't finding out about Dr. Silkworth. Now, if you're reading the book for information, it's really neat to read and find out about Dr. William Silkworth. But when you start to go for an experience, and you read the doctor's opinion as a set of questions, and you make those considerations, all of a sudden you start to have an experience with the doctor's opinion. He says, we are restless, irritable, and discontented. Am I? We who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. Do I believe that? That's when the experience starts to happen. We feel that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. Do I believe that? And on and on and on. We'll start with the doctor's opinion tomorrow morning, but I wanted to talk about how I use each part of this first section. What about Bill's story? I read Bill's story and I say, I've never been to war, I've never been married, and I'm not a stockbroker. Let's get on with it. But my sponsor just told me this is a textbook and it's meant to be done in order, and we've begun the first step now that we've started the doctor's opinion. How does Bill's story fit in with step one? So I go to one of these original members of AA that lived in Denver when I got sober. We had 3 of the original 100 members in Denver that when I got sober, and I went to one of them and I said, why do you think they put Bill's story way up here in where we're supposed to be looking at the first step, and why they put the Dr. Bob's story way back here? He said, well, I'm sure Bill's ego had something to do with it, but at the time, they found it was the best story for anybody to relate to, and the way I should look at the first 8 pages of Bill's story is to use it as a tool to look at the progression of my disease. And what they asked me to do with page 1 through 8, Bill's Drunkalogue, what they asked me to do with the first 8 pages of Bill's story was to mark everything I could relate to in 3 different areas. How he thought, how he felt, how he drank. And all of a sudden, from a story that I didn't relate to because I'd never been married, I'd never been to war, and I wasn't a stockbroker, I'm marking 3/4 of his Drunkalogue. I've seen women do it, mark more than I did. So I moved through the first 8 pages of Bill's story looking for similarities rather than the differences. And I brought that principle into meetings. Look for the similarities rather than the differences. And you know what? I started to hear those guys that weren't like me different. Skid Row for 30 years, 1,000 hospitals, their liver bloated out, DTs. But I started to listen to how he thought and how he felt and how he drank. And all of a sudden, his bottom was just like mine. I moved through Bill's Drunkalogue, and you know what it gets me back in touch with in the middle of the first part of the first step? The history of my drinking and my life, my thinking. And I'm starting to touch some pieces of myself. And all of a sudden, this chapter is about my life. And it's not just about Bill Wilson. It's a helpful tool. Then, what about Bill's recovery? Well, which pretty much starts on page 9. Our group used to make a big mistake. And I can admit my mistakes with my perceptions of this book. My group used to say, let's skip page 9 to 16 and move on into there as a solution. You know why? Bill went through the first 8 steps in a short period of time, had a big boom, and was out making amends. We're not going to get to do it that quick. Let's come back and look at what we relate to in Bill's recovery when we've done what he did. That was a mistake. What about using Bill's recovery as a guide to what it means to go to any length if this process is what you've decided to do? So, not to go backwards, but I'll share a current experience I didn't get to share with you yet about an exercise before you start the work with somebody, or before you start the work yourself, an exercise that can be as valuable for the guy doing it the first time as the guy doing it for the 5th time or the 20th time, that the man that's currently working with me this past year had me do when I started. So what I'm saying to you is, I would do this before we began the doctor's opinion with everybody that I've worked with for the last year. And what the exercise is with a statement on page 58. The last 3 lines of the second paragraph. How many of us have heard this when we were new and wondered what the hell they were talking about? If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you are ready to take certain simple steps. That is as mystifying to me at 10 years as it was at 5.5 months. Because here's what I thought at 5.5 months. What is it these people have that I'm supposed to want? Huh? The guy with the car? Or the big house? The bank? The banker? The bank account? Or the guy with the wife? The good-looking wife? Well, what is it that these people have that I'm supposed to want? And I'm supposed to be willing to go to any length to get something I don't even know what it is I'm supposed to want. And what the hell does it mean to go to any length? So this man that's currently been working with me for the last year says, do 2 things before you even start this work. Read the 12 steps on page 59, the short form, one at a time, and answer 2 questions after each step. Is this what I want to do? Am I willing to go to any length to do so? I always warn the new guys, don't confuse want with can. Because I'll tell you what, if I would have done that the first time and I got to the 9th step, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, and I would have thought that meant, can I do that? No. Doesn't mean I can, but I would like to. If I don't get some power in 1 through 8, I will not make amends. But I want to. Then, to get an idea, and I think from that exercise you get an idea of what it is that these people have that we're supposed to want to go to any length to get. And what it is a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. Then, what about an exercise to see what it means to go to any length? And this is what he told me. Read page 9 to 16 in Bill's story, and mark anything you feel resistant to or unwilling to do. Because what you get in page 9 to 16 in Bill's story is a great outline of recovery, what he was required to do to recover. Now, I wonder how many people that have done this, that are doing this for the first time, or how many people that have done this before, still, as I have each time I've started this work, would feel a little resistant to admitting one thing that Bill admitted for the first time and never had another drink after. On page 13 he says in the second paragraph, 4 lines from the top, he says, I admitted for the first time that of myself I am nothing, and that without God I am lost. And I feel some resistance to that admission. But for Bill, it was a very important admission. Something he admitted for the very first time. So, what do new people think? If I mark something in 9 to 16, I fail and you're not going to work with me? No. If you mark something in 9 to 16, use it as a barometer as to when you're done with the first step. Because when you're done with the first step, you will not feel the resistance you did when you started the first step. So I mark a few things that I feel resistant to. And when we're done with step 1, come back and see if you still feel resistant or unwilling to do those things. And you, as a sponsor, taking somebody through this, can use what they marked in 9 to 16 as a barometer to when they're done with step 1. Because believe me, and I have tried these 2 exercises, reading the 12 steps one at a time, and doing the exercise with 9 to 16 with a guy with 24 years, 18 years, 16 years, 10 years, 9 years, 7 years, a guy with 3 years, and a guy with 30 days. And every one of them was able to decide, this is what I want to do. They were able to decide, I'm willing to go to any length to do so. Every one of them marked a few things in 9 to 16 in Bill's story that they felt resistance to admitting or doing or believing or whatever Bill said there. And when we were done with step 1, there was no resistance. And I've done it myself. I will not share anything with you this weekend that I haven't done. It's an interesting exercise. And it's an interesting exercise 10 years away from my last drink, as it was looking at what I related to in Bill's story the first time. Does any lengths mean the same thing as it did when I was 5.5 months sober? Or are the stakes a little higher now after 10 years? My God, when I was new, you couldn't scare me with, Joe, for you to drink is to die. That didn't scare me. I've been dealing with life and death on a daily basis since I was 19 in the Michigan State Penitentiary. You know what scared me when Don said it? Joe, you might live a lot longer feeling the way you're feeling. To drink is to die. That's my only hope sometimes, the way I live my life. But I'll tell you what. Willing to go to any length means a lot more to me today than it did at 5.5 months. Because see, now the bet's higher. I don't want to die. I want to live. And I got some stuff in my life. And here's the biggest lie of all I saw that 7.5-year inventory. Here's what my ego showed me in inventory. Here's what my ego was doing in inventory at 7.5 years that God revealed to me. I thought the distance from my last drink had something to do with the distance from my next drink. You see, I'm 7.5 years away from my last drink. And I got all this stuff going on. Family, friends, financial security, etc., etc., a place in AA. And my ego convinced me that the 7.5 years away from my last drink had something to do with how far away I was from my next drink. But you know what the inventory revealed to me? The truth of my life for 30 years, or at least 17 of those years. The truth of my life is the further away I am from my last drink, the closer I am to my next drink. My friend says to me when I had that experience writing inventory, this man that was working with me at the time, he says, if you ever think alcohol's really far away, just look out of the corner of your eye real quick. It's right there. And it's only about that far away. And if you think any of that stuff that you've put between you and your next drink can fit in that space, just remember how all those things have been eliminated in a split second in the past. Because you know what? I've had the friends, and I've had the family, and I've had the money, and I've had the job. And in the past, those things went in a split second for me to drink again. Screw it. And now I think some of these things I think are between me and my next drink are really standing between me and my next drink. And you start to experience attention. Attention. Just a little bit of attention in the pit of your stomach. That's the tension you hope gets stronger to move you into step 2. No one in this room, if you're an alcoholic, will ever go to step 2 in a good mood. No one in this room will ever go to step 2 because it's a fun thing to do with your sponsor and we're going to frolic off to God. I think what step 1 is designed to do is to squeeze all of the virtue out of the third step decision out until it's me and my own desperation. I'm an alcoholic. I move when I'm desperate. I move when I'm backed up in the wall. I move when I've seen the truth. I move when I wake up and come out of the dream to the light. So to finish looking at the craving, we use 17 to 23 in there as a solution. After the 2 exercises with Bill's story. How do I use 17 to 23? The way I'm going to use the rest of the book. continue to turn statements into questions. Now, the hard thing is that in that section, from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23, you're going to find some things other than looking at the physical craving. Bill's story, you get in touch with the drunkalogue and your thinking and your feeling and your drinking. Even Dr. Silkworth mentioned some stuff about the mind. There is a Solution mentioned stuff about the fellowship and finding a sponsor and being a sponsor and a few other things. And we'll go through that section tomorrow morning. But what I like to stay centered on, along with all that other stuff, is I want to stay centered on the body after the first drink. Once I put alcohol in my system. And I think if there would be one basic question, which interestingly enough, the top of page 23 answers like a good textbook, if there was one pertinent question for this section, it would be, why am I powerless over alcohol physically once I take a drink? Reminding you again, we're going to look at the first step in three parts: body, mind, spirit. I would say if anybody's new and you're a little excited about what's going on tonight and you want to have a little bit more than some information when you leave here at the end of the weekend, or if you've been around for a while, if you could take 20 to 30 minutes between now and tomorrow morning, I would suggest that you do that. Read the doctor's opinion and look for a set of questions to ask yourself. Read the first 8 pages of Bill's story and get back in touch with how you thought and how you felt and how you drank. Read the rest of Bill's story. See what it means to you if you're willing to do what he did to recover, however far away you are from your last drink. And read 17 to 23 as another set of questions. Try to get back in touch with what happens to me when I start to drink. Once I start, after the first drink, does this craving really happen to me? I want to talk about this more tomorrow, and we're going to actually start at the doctor's opinion in the morning. But I want to talk about one thing, and I want to talk about it from 2 different points of view. I want to talk about it when confronted with the question, am I an alcoholic? And I want to talk about it later on at the end of the steps when confronted with the question, why do I believe God's in my life today? So from this point of view, and my friend always says, and I believe this, you can't start a spiritual process with an answer. If you start a spiritual process with an answer, you only end up with what you already started with. You have to start a spiritual process with a question. And the question in this spiritual process happens to be, am I powerless over alcohol? That's where we're going to begin. See, the bigot starts with an answer, and he ends up with an answer because he knew. The pious man starts with an answer, and he ends with the same answer because he believed. He wasn't willing to question anything. One was filled with contempt, and one was filled with acceptance. But the man of consideration is open to looking at both sides. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. So I'll tell you an interesting thing about questions. I went to this ex-Catholic priest my 3rd time through the steps, and I was going to do it with some friends, and I said, you mentioned you never assume the first step. What did you mean? He said, well, when going through the steps for the 26th time, I never assumed that last year's first step is the same way I feel about it now, because I'm a year further from my last drink, and I'm a year more awake. Maybe now I see it different than last year. Maybe having fully conceded to my innermost self at 9 years isn't the same as conceding to my innermost self at 10 years. So I never assumed last year's first step. I said, I see a little bit about what you mean. He said, Joe, let me ask you a question. And I don't want to scare any of the new people with this, but he says, every time you go through these chapters to look at step 1, the chapters that we'll cover in 3 parts, to look at body, mind, and spirit, he said, whenever you go through these chapters to look at step 1, do you always look in those chapters for the right questions to see why you're alcoholic? And I said, yeah, that's the way I learned it from the man that worked with me. He said, why don't you go through those questions this time looking at the idea that maybe you're not? And the mere thought of that brought up in me a terror that he said I needed to go into the middle of rather than just avoid all the time, and there's where I would find my answer. And that I should look at questions as coins, 2 sides to every question. We are restless, irritable, and discontented. Maybe I am. But maybe I'm really not. We must believe that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as the mind. Do I believe that? For me, my body is quite as abnormal as my mind. Well, maybe I do. But you know what? Maybe I really don't believe that. And I don't want to scare anybody, but I have to say to you, in the last 6 or so years, I have gotten more benefit from the first step by looking at maybe I'm not, to find out that I really am, than just going through and answering these questions that I'm so familiar with. Yes, 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 yes. And I caught myself doing that a couple years ago, and I was reviewing these first chapters, and I was considering the first step proposals, and I was answering real quick. Is that me? Yes. Do I believe that? Yes. Is that me? Yes. Does that happen to me? Yes. And it dawned on me, Joe, you're using your answers to avoid the question. And you know what? The answer isn't so important. What's important is what happens between asking the question and answering it when you wonder about it. When you wonder about it. I said to my mother one time, Mom, you know, she's a normal drinker. She'll have a drink and a half. I mean, not even 2 drinks. She'll have a drink and a half. That makes absolutely no sense to me. And I said to my mother one time, to just see the reaction of a normal person, I said, Mom, you know what? I don't think you're an alcoholic. And I bet you could take 2 drinks a day for 30 days, no more, no less. She giggled and she said, yeah, that would probably be a little bit too much. And when I presented that question to myself, or someone else has said it to me to consider it, Joe, maybe you're not an alcoholic, and you could probably take 2 drinks a day for 30 days, no more, no less, there comes up inside of me terror. Now, all my life I avoid terror at any cost because my ego doesn't want to see truth. So I do whatever I do to avoid that question. Some people will say, oh, that's stinking thinking. You're setting yourself up to drink even thinking that, because they think what they think is what keeps them sober. Their mind is what keeps, if you think bad, you're bad. If you think good, you're good. And if you don't think about drinking, you won't get drunk because your mind is what's keeping you sober. The people that have encouraged me say, why don't you consider that, Joe? Because when that terror comes up, the mere consideration of doing that, maybe I'm not an alcoholic, and I could take 2 drinks a day for 30 days, it's in that terror, if I can get into the middle of it, that my answer lies. Because that terror comes from my heart, and my heart knows there's no way I could do that. So, why don't we stop there tonight, and I would hope that those that are interested would come back tomorrow morning, and I would hope that some of you might go for more than knowledge this weekend, or information. That we might really, some of us, have a real experience, or at least some nifty tools to take back the next time we go through the steps. Thanks. Morning, everybody. My name is Joe. I'm an alcoholic. I think just to talk a little bit about some of the things we went over last night, in case there's anybody here that wasn't here last night. I think basically there was some things on my mind that I wanted to get off of it and just get out there and kind of feel like we were really at the beginning of this. We took about 2 hours last night. Because of that, we won't be able to spend as much time with step one as I would like, but I think the reality of this for me is, Danny and I were talking last night, and you know, I was telling her that I couldn't really do what I did 5 years ago. I think that's probably true for a lot of us. What I used to get by on when I was new and some of the stuff that I got away with just isn't acceptable to me anymore. And nor could I redo what I did on tape 5 years ago at a small little Salvation Army in Santa Monica with a crowd that was about as receptive as a brick wall. It was interesting how those came about, and I'm glad I'm a little further on than I was then. I was really only 5 years sober when I made the ones that Terry has. I had done some work, and I'd been through the steps several times, and I felt that I could talk about it, but if I would have ever known what was going to become of those tapes, I would have thought about it, you know. All I knew is that I was asked to go to a Salvation Army for 12 weeks, and I asked the guy what he wanted me to do, and he said, the same thing you would do with somebody in your living room if you were taking them through the steps. I said, you don't mean one step a week? He said, no, just do whatever you want, stay as long as you want. It just turned out to be 12 tapes, and Terry's got him down to 8 in his set, and a friend of mine asked me, could he go along? He has trouble reading. He says it helps him a lot when he can get it down on tape and go home and listen to it. And I thought they were just going to be for him. And several months later, he's sharing them with the people he sponsors, and he says, why don't you try them out with somebody you're sponsoring? And I would have somebody over, and when I sponsor somebody, that means they come to my house once a week, and we start on the title page, and we go all the way through, because that's all I know. That's what Don P. from Denver did with me. And I started finding out that if I could give him something to work on when we worked together between appointments, it kept him more centered. And I'd give him a little bit of the book to read. We like to, in our group, because sometimes you can't just lay the whole first step on somebody. So we kind of break the book down into sections, or a piece at a time, and we break the first step into 3 parts: body, mind, and spirit. And we'd read a little bit together, like maybe we had to skim over it last night, but maybe we would read from up to the doctor's opinion, and then I would tell them how to work with that and go home and have them work on it some more and come back and kind of go over it again. And then we'd go on a little bit further, and then all of a sudden he was getting lots of calls to make tapes, and he's not a taper, and he got tired of doing that, and we sent a set off to a guy in Indiana, and then Terry got a set, and what's come of those tapes is, you know, I'm glad that they've helped some people, but I'm still really glad I didn't know what was going to become of them when I did it. So how do I get past that today? I took a few notes of some things I wanted to say last night, but I didn't even get to look at them. I just said a prayer in the room and just come with what comes. I mean, if I did this again next week, you wouldn't hear the same thing next week that you heard this week. I mean, I just can't. I'm not a kind of guy that can do that. There are speakers that I know that I heard when I was new, and then I heard them when I was about 5, and I heard them recently. And we're talking every little syllable, every little shake of the head, every little joke, every little laugh, every little pause, every little drink is the same. And someone who stays involved in these steps and continues to do the work, my God, it's just changing every day. Nor do I really want to repeat what I did yesterday today, or what I did last year, or what I did 5 years ago. That's what's exciting to me about Alcoholics Anonymous. I was telling everybody last night about a woman in my life. I call her my spiritual advisor, and along with my sponsor, who's a man. They're both from Denver. I currently live in Santa Monica, California, and I have people in Santa Monica that I'm accountable to, and I have a home group, and I have people there that I've gone through the steps with for me. So I'm not isolated from that kind of sponsorship or that kind of. I have real strong feelings in the last couple of years about being accountable and people knowing me. And I woke up one day in California. I'd been there for about a year, and I had an inventory. I had been through a small workshop where a group of people get together and do the work together as a group. And I woke up and I had this inventory written, and you know what my head said? There's only one man that can hear this inventory, and that's Don. And the next thought was, if you believe that, you're a dead man. And I quick called a couple guys that I had once worked with that had gone on, and they were doing their own thing, and I said, I need to fifth step. And I needed to let some people in California get to know me on that level. And I have since done it with several other people that are in my group. I'm not above that. So I think some of the things we talked about yesterday is moving beyond knowledge, the difference between knowledge and experience, and a little bit about a prayer that I've used, and I encourage people to say it in their own way, in their own words, to ask God to please put aside what I think I know. It's really only a prayer to asking God to help you get past your ego. The biggest part of my ego is what I think I know, and that's what it wants to hold on to. We talked about the title page, and that's pretty basic stuff. We got a 3-part program here: unity, recovery, and service. We got a 3-part disease: body, mind, and spirit. There's a part of the program for each part of the disease. You bring your body to the fellowship, you bring your mind to the recovery program, you take your awakened spirit out into the world and back into the program to be of service, and you can become whole. That's what the circle's all about. There's 36 spiritual principles rather than just 12. 12 traditions, 12 steps, 12 concepts. And the experience I had with somebody sharing that with me when I was at 5.5 months dry opened me up to the program. I think for those that want to see how I lay this out to somebody before we really get into it, just considering the first step. So actually, if we're going to talk, this is a textbook, and we're going to talk from the beginning of this book. We're talking about from the title page, and this is for me, from the title page to the middle of page 52 in the chapter to the agnostic, as a section in this book, we break it down into 4 pieces. So for lack of a better word, we'll call section number 1 from the title page up to the doctor's opinion. And the way I encourage people to look at that is just general information about the program. I wish we could have spent a little more time with the preface and the forewords, but there's a lot to cover before tomorrow. And It's good to read that with somebody that's had experience with all three parts of the program, because it basically talks about from our symbol and that great promise on the title page through the preface and the idea that this is a textbook. I would want to go through that with somebody that's had experience with this being a textbook and the process in this text. And then it goes into the foreword to the first edition from 1939 to 1955, and then into the second edition and the history of this program and how it grew, and into the foreword to the third edition. But I don't see that as beginning step one. I just see that as the first part of the book. And there's some great general information about our program there. When I start step one with somebody, and so this can kind of be in a more orderly fashion today, we also talked about an exercise, working with a statement in how it works that we all hear all the time, on page 58, which says, if you want what we have, and you're willing to go to any length to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. So before I begin any of this with somebody, before we get into the doctor's opinion, they're not only doing that set-aside prayer in their own way, in their own words. I do encourage people to pray on their knees. I don't think that's for God. I think that's an act of submission for me. I don't think it's to please God. But I encourage people to pray on their knees, and I encourage people to, in the front of their book, they write out this prayer like they'd like to say it. Because sometimes some guys have specific areas of their life that they want to have a new experience with. I work with a lot of people that have done the steps before, and I have them add those areas that they'd like to have an open mind and a new experience with to their prayer. For example, let's say the last time I started this prayer, and I think the book does refer to it, and we talked about that too. We had to let go of our old ideas. We beg of you to lay aside prejudice. The guy that Bill and Bob are 12-stepping, the moment I made up my mind to go through with the process, I had to throw several lifelong conceptions out the window. So I think the people that have done this a lot longer than I have, that have encouraged me, think the book really refers to it, but they never tell me how to say it. So for example, the last time I used this prayer, I said something like, Dear God, please set aside everything I think I know about myself and this book and these steps and this program and my disease and you and money and my health and relationships, so that I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please help me see the truth. Amen. It's an interesting thing that at one point, now I'm not saying that what I know is what keeps me sober. A lot of people think that it is. I don't think that what I know keeps me sober. But there is, at one point, like say this morning, my hope it would be that the power of God would flow through me and that His words would flow through me and that self could be put aside. But there are times when you kind of working with others or sharing or speaking or doing whatever you're doing, you kind of have to draw on what you know, even though you're trying to share your experience. So at one point, like from the time I finish amends until I start the work again, which is most of each year for me nowadays, I don't spend that much time when I go through the steps anymore. I might be 1 month from one to finishing amends. And the rest of the year I'm in 10, 11, and 12. But there is a point on this path of continuing to work these steps. We talked about that a lot last night too, why I do that. I basically rework the first 9 steps on a regular basis because number 1, I don't ever want to drink again, and this has worked. Number 2, I like where it takes me. Number 3, a handful of people in my life that do this on a regular basis have what I want. And number 4, every time I do it, my whole life takes off. I mean, unbelievable things happen each time through the first 9 steps. So there is a point in this path where what I know is a benefit. It helps me. Now, I don't think it's what keeps me sober, but what I know is beneficial. Then there comes a desire within myself, I would like to have a new experience. And I decide about going through the steps again. At that point, what I know becomes a barrier to moving any further. What I know becomes a liability rather than an asset. It's like a wall. What I know is actually in the way. For example, is it what I think I know about what's wrong with me that keeps me sober? Or is it my experience with alcohol that takes me to the next step? Or is it what I think I know about God that keeps me sober? No. What I think I know about God is what usually gets in the way between me experiencing God. Okay, so what I know at sometimes is helpful. And now, starting this work again, what I know becomes a wall that I need to somehow break through to get past where I am. That's my desire in going through the steps again. I don't want to go through the steps again and end up with what I had last year, even though I was in a great place last year. I want to continue to grow in understanding and effectiveness. I now use the 10th and 11th step to go back through the work. But you can't do that the first time. First time you don't have any power and you're seeking power. So, when we get to the doctor's opinion, they're doing the prayer, and I give them an exercise with, do you want what we have, and are you willing to go to any length to get it? Because most people, new or old or in between, don't know what it really is that we have to offer and what it really means to go to any length. So we give them this exercise. Read the 12 steps and how it works, one at a time, the short form. Read each of the 12 steps, pausing after each one, answering 2 questions. Is this what I want to do? And am I willing to go to any length to do this? I think that exercise, once you get to the 12th step, gives somebody an idea of what it means, of what it is that we have to offer. I don't think what we have to offer here is job counseling or relationship counseling or family counseling or a welfare office or a job search. I think what we really have to offer here is a spiritual experience sufficient to recover from alcoholism. That's what the 12th step tells me. Am I willing to do what's necessary to get what these people have to offer? Then if they want an idea of what it means to go to any length, I refer them to page 9 to 16 in Bill's story, where his recovery is outlined. A basic review of what he was required to do to recover. And I have them mark whatever they currently feel resistant to or unwilling to do. Now, they don't fail if they mark anything. If they mark anything, that's our barometer as to when they're done with step 1. Because when someone's done with step 1, I don't care how long they're sober, when they once again see the nature of their condition, other than just up here, when they get it, when they experience it, they'll go back through those 9 pages, from 9 to 16, they'll go back through those pages and they won't be resistant to any of the things they were when they started step 1. That's been my experience. So they're doing the prayer, they do the exercise with the 12 steps and 9 to 16 in Bill's story. Sometimes, and I believe working with others is about following your intuition and using this power to help others. Sometimes I have them read the first 164 pages. Sometimes I know the guy, we might just do a little piece at a time. He might be working on that prayer for a few weeks. I'll tell you, I've seen some people with some time begin that prayer, and just open up. Now, let's say somebody that's never done that prayer was to start that prayer the next time they go through the steps. What's the normal reaction to that prayer? Well, don't think the normal reaction to that prayer is that you're going to be feeling great. The normal reaction to that prayer is that you might begin to wonder about some things you thought you knew. Then you know the prayer is working. I told you about my last experience with that prayer, 9 years sober. I started the prayer, I did it for 3 weeks. Somewhere in those 3 weeks, I woke up 5 days in a row really wondering and having some real doubt about whether I've ever had this physical craving for booze. And I looked at it 9 other times. And I knew the prayer was working because I was put in a position where I was wondering about both sides of every question. We talked about that last night, being open, having an open mind, not being the bigot or the pious man, being taken to a place through this prayer where I'm in the middle. I have an idea about that that's come from my experience, and that is to receive grace, to move beyond where you are. You can only receive that kind of grace in the middle, where you're open to both sides of every question. Now, you can receive grace to stay where you are on either end of the scale, knowing, believing, staying where you are, banking on what you already know. But to receive grace and power to move beyond where you are, you somehow must be placed in the middle. And the middle to me means open to whatever question we bring up. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I believe it's in that place. Other spiritual books use other terms, and some of them even call it the middle, where I can receive power and grace to move beyond where I am. And I believe that's a spiritual state, and I believe that's a state of consciousness. And I believe that state can come in a matter of a few moments, and it's a shift in thinking and perception. So they're doing the prayer, they've done the exercise with the 12 steps in Bill's story, marking anything they're not willing to do or that they feel resistant to, and we've gone from the title page up to the doctor's opinion, and I've encouraged them to look at that as some general information about the program, and we get to the doctor's opinion. So I don't have to repeat these several times. We're going to break the first step into 3 sections. Section number 1 is from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23. For lack of a better term, we'll call that the body after the first drink. We're going to look at the first step in 3 parts: body, mind, and spirit. Then it's real interesting in the book. After all that, the book says we're not only bodily and mentally ill, we are spiritually sick. After they've laid those 3 parts out. So to look at the physical craving, we're going to use those pages from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23. You'll find a shift at the top of page 23 where it goes from a summary, like a pop quiz, on everything you should have seen about the craving. Just to show you how I use that, at the top of 23 it says, the experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. Confirm what? Back to the bottom of 22. That once I put alcohol into my system, something happens, both in the bodily and the mental sense, which makes it virtually impossible for me to stop. That's the last time the book is going to talk about in the first 11 steps. The last time it's going to talk about what happens to me once I start to drink. And it's kind of that bottom of 22 and the top of 23 kind of sums up everything we've needed to be convinced of from the doctor's opinion to the top of 23. Now we're going to spend some time with that in a minute, but let me break down the other 2 sections real quick. Section 2, that would be the second section of the book where we've gotten past from the title page to the doctor's opinion, that general info, and we've moved into the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23 to look at the physical part of alcoholism, to look at the body after the first drink. Now, section 3, we're going to look at page 23 to the bottom of page 43. You'll also find that 43 ends with a little quiz on everything you should be convinced of from 23 to 43. And I think that's a great example of a good textbook. Remember those little books we used to use when we were kids that would do addition, and they'd give you examples, and they'd give you little quizzes, and then at the end of the chapter there'd be a test summing up everything from that chapter on addition, and then they'd do it with subtraction. I find this book to be the same way. So at the bottom of 43, what is it I need to be convinced of about my mind, this phenomena that takes place before I even take a drink? Well, I need to be convinced that at a certain time there will be no effective mental defense against the first drink, and in a few rare cases, neither me nor any other human being will be able to provide that defense. My defense must come from a higher power. So I see those two pages, the top of 23 and the bottom of 43, as major turning points that I don't go any further with somebody unless they're convinced of those. Now, what if I get to page 23 with somebody and they don't see that they get this physical craving? They stay in it until they see, whether they see they don't have it or whether they have it. Now, if they don't have it, I wouldn't go any further with anybody, because why in the world would you need power if you could control the amount of alcohol you drink once you start to drink it? I would tell them, go live your life, decide never to drink again, or every time you drink, just do it, just control it the way you'd like to, and find a spiritual path, because this path will not be something you're going to be open to. Then maybe they have a drug history, and we need to look at, are they powerless over drugs? I am not one of these people that classifies alcoholism as addiction or addiction as alcoholism because of my experience. I did a lot of drugs. I found out in the first step, and I don't want to belabor this morning because it's always the big issue, but in our group, we don't herd people together like a bunch of cows and say, if you had a problem with freebasing cocaine, you're the same as this guy over here that only drank. We're all the same. Welcome to our meeting. We don't do that in our group. In our group, we give people the dignity, and this is one point that I would like to make, to find out their own truth with the first half of step one. Now, there's a lot of programs that use our steps, but what do you notice in every program? There's a different word in the first half of the first step. Is it food? Is it alcohol? Is it cocaine? Is it narcotics? Is it sex? Is it money? Is it gambling? These people that have put these programs together from the very start of ours know one basic thing. The 12 steps are a spiritual process to deflate the ego and experience the power of God. They also know if you start a spiritual process with a lie and go through the first 9 steps, you will be worse when you get to amends than when you started. I've seen it happen. You start a spiritual process based on a lie, you get worse. I've seen men and women that belong in Al-Anon somehow get talked into alcoholism and buy the lie and do the first step based on they're an alcoholic, get to the 9th step crazier than when they started. I have seen addicts that belong in NA or CA get talked into alcoholism or buy it for $12,000 from somebody and get and take their first step based on something they're not, get to or through the 9th step worse than when they started. I think one of the most dangerous things in all these programs, and we're exposed to so many in California, it's sickening. They have a 12-step program for everything where I live, and they would have us all pretty much the same. They would want me believing that my addiction to nicotine, or your addiction to coffee, or some of these other things, is the same as alcoholism. I don't buy it. You'd really have to stretch your mind to convince me that drinking coffee is the same as me drinking alcohol. I don't buy it. Because some men sat down with me and helped me see some of the differences. I don't want to go into a whole long thing with that. I encourage people to find their own truth with the first half of step 1. From there on, we're going to be the same if we have any of these diseases. Al-Anon has a spiritual malady, and from the second half of step 1 to the end of the steps, we're going to do the same thing. I've worked with addicts because I didn't know whether I was when I came here, and somebody helped me find out my own truth. So I work with guys that don't know. Sometimes we find they're an addict, sometimes we find they're an alcoholic, sometimes we find they're both. But if you use the simple outline in this book, all it does is help you look at 2 major points. Are you powerless over it once you start? And are you powerless over it every time you've ever stopped? That's all they spend the first 53 pages of this book to look at. From the doctor's opinion to the bottom of 43 is just to get clear on the symptoms. The symptoms of what happens to me when I start and what happens to me when I stop. And then, on page 44, they say that they hope these preceding chapters have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic, and then they repeat those 2 basic points that they want you to be convinced of after all that work. When you honestly want to, you can't stop entirely. You can't stay stopped. And when drinking, you have little control over the amount. You're probably an alcoholic. I also find at the bottom of page 20 that helps me look at the three types of drinkers. You know, where it goes into the moderate and the heavy and the real alcoholic. Those are as real for people that use drugs as it is for people that drink alcohol. The same three classifications fit for drug users. There's the moderate drug user, he can take it or leave it. There's the hard drug user, might have a habit, gradually enough to kill him, impair him physically and mentally. It might cause him to die a few years before his time. But give that guy that uses a lot of drugs a sufficiently strong reason, he stops, walks away from it, never does it again. But what about the real addict? Given a sufficiently strong reason, ill health, falling in love, warning of a doctor, change of environment, he uses again. I use the same criteria to help anybody who comes to me find out their own truth with the first half of step one. I did a lot of drugs. A man sat down with me and helped me see that when I wanted to, I walked away from drugs. Made up my mind and walked away from them. And I've been strung out on a couple. When I was given a sufficient reason, I walked away from drugs. The addicts that I've worked with absolutely can't do that. They do with drugs what I did with booze, because for 17 years I couldn't walk away from alcohol, given every sufficient reason I was ever given. And I find out my own truth. I work with people with dignity. Give them the dignity to find their own truth. We're not in a program to sell people what we have. My God, if you would have asked me 2 years ago, Joe, what's your goal with people you work with, and what do you really like to see them do? You know what I would have said to you 2 years ago? My goal with people I work with is to watch them do these 12 steps and watch their life change. Now ask me now, 2 years later, Joe, what's the goal with the people you work with, and what do you really like to see them do? My goal is to help them find that maybe there's anything else in the world they could possibly do besides this, and watch them discover truth. And if this truth is what they discover, I love to watch them do this and watch their life change. But my job anymore isn't to sell people the 12 steps, and isn't to convince people there's something they're not. My job is to help people seek truth and get free. This is kind of a scary story, but I'll tell it anyway. A kid was in our group for 6 years. He had a few years in the fellowship. He hit bottom. He wasn't getting it in that AA, in that part of AA. Came to our group, went through the steps, got to the 9th step, found out he was alcoholic. That was his truth with step 1. Got to the 9th step, he was worse. He was crazy, he was full of pain, he was full of doubt, he was miserable. And this was after 20 or 30 amends where most people are just on fire and it's just popping and it's happening. Those promises are coming true. He was experiencing the opposite. Went back to the steps, to a workshop. The first time he did it one-on-one with somebody. Went to a workshop, found out the same thing. Wrote inventory, 5th step, got to the 9th step, same thing going on. He came to my house and we started talking about step 1. I said, how did any of these people let you get by with this? The guy hardly ever drank. He was about as much alcoholic as the man in the moon. Couldn't see it. I could see it. It wasn't my place to tell him. It's his place to find out. Couldn't see it. Now, I knew the guy had been around for a while. I don't know if I would ever tell this to anybody, but I trust what comes. And what came was, tell this guy this. And I thought, tell this guy what? Tell this guy this. Open your mouth, and here it came. I said, you know what you need to do? You need to buy a new big book, and on your way home, a bottle of whiskey. And take those 2 home and set them by your bed. And pray every day and ask God, which one of these tools should I use to find out the truth about my alcoholism? Please show me which one. And he'd been around for 6.5 years. He did that prayer every day for about 10 days, and he woke up one day and he said, there was no decision to make. It was made for him. He absolutely knew. And he popped the top on that bottle, and he took 2 shots, and he put the top back on, and he went to work. Nothing happened. Took 2 shots the next morning, nothing happened, went to work. Took 2 shots the next morning, went to work, nothing happened. He did that for 30 days. Nothing happened. He found out he's not an alcoholic. Went on with his life. He's doing great. He described an experience finding out that he wasn't, that was similar to my experience finding out that I was. He said he felt like 2,000 pounds of superstition and lies were lifted off his back. He said he felt like he'd finally found out the truth about what was wrong with him. I mean, it was me describing my experience, finding out I was, him describing his experience, finding out he wasn't, because we had both discovered truth. I am much more excited about people finding truth and seeking freedom than just doing some piddly-ass things to feel better and get a little bit of relief and live a lie. I mean, it wouldn't be out of the scope of my life to once again find out for a period of time I've believed a lie. I mean, my inventory is filled with times, periods of times, sometimes big chunks of time in my life, especially my first inventory, where I belabored under a lie. I believed a lie for a period of time. It wouldn't be outside the scope of my life to once again find out that's what's going on here, but at least I'd be free and I would know the truth. So I think with the first half of step 1, we give people the dignity to find out what they are. I think the tendency sometimes in some AA groups is anybody that comes around talk them into being an alcoholic, and then in the other programs they talk them into being a cocaine addict rather than encouraging them to find out what are you really. So if we look at the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23 to look at the physical craving, and then we use 23 to 43 to look at the mental obsession. One is what happens after the first drink as far as the craving. The other is what happens before the first drink, which is the obsession. How come a lot of people don't find pertinent information in this book to look at the second half of step 1? The unmanageability. Where do you find the unmanageability after the book has so greatly laid out the symptoms, body and mind? Well, we use 3 pages from We Agnostics to look at the unmanageability, which would be section number 4, the spirit. This is the condition that goes on before and after the first drink, except when the alcohol's working. This is the spiritual malady. We use page 44, page 45, and the middle paragraph on page 52. And all of a sudden I started to see that the book lays the problem out the same way as the disease. Body, mind, that's the first half of step 1. 2 parts to this idea about powerlessness. And spirit, the second half of step 1. The spiritual malady is the unmanageability. And the unmanageability is untreated alcoholism. I used to hear those 3 terms, and I don't know what I thought they were, but I somehow thought those 3 terms were different from each other. Sometimes in meetings I would hear the term untreated alcoholism. Then other times I would hear the spiritual malady, like when the book says, when the spiritual malady is overcome, we'll straighten out mentally and physically. And then I would hear the term unmanageability. So I'm working with these 3 terms: untreated alcoholism, spiritual malady, unmanageability. Now I know we're not there yet, but what I found out was that they're all 3 the same. The spiritual malady is the unmanageability, and the unmanageability of my life is the description of untreated alcoholism. They're 3 terms that mean the same thing. So now all of a sudden I start to see the first step in 2 parts, but I actually see 2 parts to the first part. As far as powerlessness, this admission of powerlessness over alcohol, both physically and mentally. So let's go back to that and talk about working with the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23. I like to look at this section the material in the book which is helpful to help me look at the physical craving after the first drink. Keep in mind, those of you that are new, the physical craving for alcohol only happens after I take a drink. We hear somebody sit in a meeting someday and they're 5, 10, 15 years sober and they're saying, today I was craving alcohol. No, they weren't craving alcohol. They were obsessed about it or they were thinking about it. The craving only takes place after the ingestion of whatever it is you're taking. How do we use the doctor's opinion? We learn to turn statements into questions. He makes a statement, then it will no longer be a doctor's opinion. Because a doctor's opinion isn't going to do any good if it isn't me. We're going to go over in the next room and listen to some great doctors talk about something that none of us have. I want to find out that what the doctor is talking about is something that describes me. So I learned, rather than looking in this book, and we talked about this last night, rather than looking in this book for answers, so I don't have to look within myself. Remember, the first step says we had to fully concede to our innermost self. That doesn't mean it happens up here. It starts up here, but there's a way to get it down here, so it's a gut level, full concession to your innermost self. And I found one of the tools to do that would be the set-aside prayer, in your own words, in your own way, and moving into step, and deciding this is what I want to do, and then I'm willing to go to any length, and then I'm ready to take certain steps, then moving into step 1 and beginning to use the doctor's opinion as a set of questions. Now, we don't have time to go through and read the entire chapter, as much as I would like to, but we can pause at some of those pertinent questions, like on XXIV. I still don't know Roman numerals. What is that? 24. Middle paragraph. You know, in the first edition, the first 16 printings of this book, he didn't sign his letter. If you've ever seen one, I collect first editions, and I have the first 6 so far. Charlie's been helping me, and in the first edition, it says, "Very truly yours, blank, 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 M.D." You know, I wonder, he wasn't really quite sure about us then, right? Before he was willing to add his name to it. The physician who at our request gave us this letter has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement he confirms that we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe, there's a must, that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as the mind. Question, do I believe that? And I consider that. I don't look at that as an answer and just go, oh, well, if the book says it, it must be true. My body is quite as abnormal as my mind. No. I haven't just found an answer. I have just found a question that needs to be considered in some place other than my head. So I consider it. How does somebody consider a question rather than just with what they already know? You consider it experientially. Experientially. An experiential consideration means I go back to my experience drinking. When I take a drink, do I lose control? Just the same as I lose control every time I've stopped drinking. One goes on in my mind, one goes on in my body. Do I believe that my body is quite as abnormal as my mind when it comes to me drinking or not drinking? So I consider that by looking at my experience. We also talked about looking at questions as coins, and every time you come to a question, look at both sides of the question. Maybe I do believe that. Maybe I don't believe that. Did it ever satisfy me to be told that I couldn't control my drinking just because I was maladjusted to life? Well, I was certainly told that a lot. They sent me to a child psychologist before I ever took a drink. And I certainly went to a lot of people after I started drinking. that told me, Joe, you're not quite right. Did that ever satisfy me as to why I couldn't control my drinking? Well, sometimes there was some explanation to it. In fact, to some extent, these things were true. But with me, my body was sick as well, and nobody ever explained that to me. And when they started to explain that to me, and I had this picture of the alcoholic which left out the physical factor, it felt incomplete. But when I started to consider this doctor's idea that I have an allergy to alcohol, it began to interest me. My opinion as to whether it was true, of course, meant a lot because, see, I'd been a professional. But as an ex-problem drinker, see, as a professional, there was a lot of information connected with that idea. But as an ex-problem drinker, it made good sense. It explained many things that I could never otherwise account. So see, I start to read this as questions, and I start to consider those questions. I start to make those first step considerations, and something starts to happen down here. I described it last night. I don't know how else to describe it as, I think people experience truth in different ways, but my experience with truth that my ego doesn't want to see usually creates a tension, just the beginning of some sort of feeling of desperation. Gee, I'm really starting to see here there's something really wrong with me. A lot different than when I said, oh yeah, I'm powerless over alcohol because it got me in a lot of trouble. So you move through the chapter. On XXVI. We believe that, and so suggested, that the action of alcohol in these chronic alcoholics is the manifestation of an allergy. This phenomenon of craving is limited to this case and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. Did it occur in me? Can I safely use alcohol? Have I formed the habit? Can I break it? Have I lost my self-reliance, my self-confidence, my reliance on things human? Have my problems piled up on me and become astonishingly difficult to solve? Does frothy emotional appeal work? That includes mine and theirs. My frothy emotional appeal is guilt, remorse, feeling bad when I wake up the next morning. Did that ever keep me sober very long? My own frothy emotional appeal? What about other people's frothy emotional appeal? The screaming wife, the yelling judge, the sobbing mother. Does frothy emotional appeal work? Okay. Here's a great one for people that have been around the fellowship for a while. Do I believe the